The Western Wall today, a very interesting thing happened there recently is a man by the name of AlayhisSalam, who's the director of archaeology, found a coin underneath the very lowest stone, where the stones reach bedrock under the Western Wailing Wall. And a lot of people have been arguing how old this was. Well, kind of it was settled because AlayhisSalam dug underneath and found underneath the lowest stone that reaches bedrock. He found a coin of Valerius Gratus, who was the prefect of Rome under Tiberius Caesar. The coin dated to 20 AD. Very interesting because Herod died in 4 BC. So 24 years after Herod's death, we have this wall being built attributed to Herod, which poses a lot of very interesting questions as to who really built this wall and why did they build it.
Omar and his family have owned the old city of Jerusalem's most famous antique jewelry shop for 9 generations, dating back 388 years. His shop has a dazzling variety of antiques and coins that have been unearthed in numerous excavations in Jerusalem over the years, including from the supposed Temple Mount area. I asked Omar if any artifacts or other evidence had ever been found that proved the Jewish temples stood there.
Actually, regardless to the excavation that started after the war from 1967, and we know and everybody knows through the experts that they brought and from all over the world, the historians, and through pretty much like digging in every spot, in every centimeters, you know, they flip everything, even each inch was digged, you know, they couldn't find any evidence that the Temple Mount is beneath the Haram al Sharif, or what they call the Temple Mount now. And that's a fact, you know, everybody knows that, you know.
I think that all those stones that are up there today that you see on the Haram or from a Roman fortress, of course there's been a lot of additions since then of people that have come in and conquered, moved around, but basically a lot of those, I think, most of them were generally part of a Roman fort called Fortress Antonio, named after Mark Antony. It housed the 10th Roman legions, which was about 6,000 soldiers and about 4,000 support personnel. It would have been like a city up there. Josephus, in fact, describes it as being the size of several cities. But we see the Roman forts. We don't see a couple of pup tents and a bunch of people walking around with spears and shields. It was a machine. They had roads, they had bakeries, they had brothels, they had courtrooms, they had barracks. It was like a city. And today we've never found any remnants of where the Roman fort was. And of course the fort would have been quite large, and I think archaeology would have revealed something by now if it was located somewhere other than on the Temple Mount.
Another reason the Haram couldn't be the temple is when we look at the historical records. Let's go to Josephus. Josephus clearly said that the city was so raised that you would never even know a city stood there. And we see it when we go in ancient Jerusalem. You see that everything was destroyed from that time period. In the New Testament, Yeshua said the same thing. He said not one stone would be upon another. And there, in what they're calling the Temple Mount, the Haram, you have 10,000 Herodian stones, 10,000. So not only do you have 10,000 stones that aren't supposed to be there, but if that's the temple and not the Fort Antonia, the stones should not be Herodian stones at the base, they should be Solomitic stones. So that fact alone, that there's no Solomitic stones, but they did find the Solomitic stones in the city of David, and they did find the tower that Nehemiah built. They found it there. They have the archaeological evidence of the oil lamps and the pottery from the Persian era from that time. Clearly shows that the temple had to be in the city of David and not in the Haram.
Antonia, which we believe is the Haram al Sharif, or the Haram al Sharif was the remnants of Fort Antonia, encompasses an area of 36 acres. And basically it is the size of a typical Roman fortress, according to schematics and even remnants of other permanent Roman fortresses all over Europe, in Germany, and other places, even in Africa. The fort that was built by King Herod of Israel is typical of a Roman fortification built to their specifications of that time period.
Another thing that most of the historians have neglected is the fact of, Josephus tells us the size of the temple. The size of the temple was 600 feet square. It was a square. It's very, very simple when you look at the records. Now, it was enlarged by Herod, but certainly not to the point of the size that you see the harem. Now, the interesting thing, when you look at the size of the harem, it's 96% exactly the size of every ancient Roman fort. And remember, the Roman fort was the property of the Roman Empire. Just like today, the United States of America has hundreds of bases in different countries. Those bases are owned by the United States of America, even though they're in a foreign country. And it was the same thing in this time. So when you're looking at that fort, not only the size of it had to be standard, but also remember that in an area where Jews were not intermingling with Romans, it had to be big enough that you can house your at least a legion of soldiers. That beside the soldiers that you had to have personnel that was working. You had a red light district. You had to have restaurants. You had to have probably 10 to 15,000 people. And whenever you look at a model of Jerusalem, like you saw in Jerusalem by Jonah, they always make Fort Antonia this tiny little fort that couldn't probably hold 100 people.
The model that we have at the Israeli Museum is a beautiful model. It's a great piece of art, but a poor piece of historical reflection. For instance, I believe that the Roman fort there is ridiculous. It's just this little appendage. The mighty Roman fortress has been reduced to this small little caricature that they have there in that model. So I don't think that the model maker there made an accurate representation. But what he did do is he's impregnated into the mind of a lot of visitors a warped concept of the size of the Roman fortress and where the Roman fortress is. I'm really surprised that most people don't go up and say, this is ridiculous. What do we have this here for, this size and this dimensions? The Roman fortress was immense. And it wasn't just this small little appendage that they have there, because we know that they had the 10th Roman Legion, which was about 10,000 people. That area could have held maybe a couple hundred people that we have at the model at the Israeli Museum.
And even in the New Testament, when you look at the Apostle Paul, now they don't even know who he is. They're thinking he's this Egyptian that did this. And here it is, this nobody, because there was a plan to kill him on the way to Caesarea. They send 450 soldiers and accompaniment with him. Now, if there was only 600 soldiers in that fort, is it logical that almost every single person in the fort is going to go with an unknown person that they don't even know who it is? Of course not. So that alone shows us there were thousands of people. I mean, Jerusalem was a place where there was a lot of trouble going on, particularly at holy days, and there were thousands of troops that had to be there to quench any kind of trouble that would come. And like I said, the dimensions of the harem being exactly the dimensions of every Roman fort and completely opposite of any dimension of the Temple Mount that's told to us in the historical records is another proof that that just couldn't be the Temple Mount.